the towers that stand against time. There are few structures more iconic in the history of human civilization than the medieval castle. Towering, often isolated, and in many cases crumbling into romantic ruins overgrown with ivy and moss, castles have become symbols of a time when humanity lived in a world constantly on the edge of conflict and survival. Today we may look at these stone giants with a sense of awe and curiosity, often imagining them as picturesque remnants of an era long past, featured in novels, films, and perhaps even the occasional tourist brochure. But before they became the stuff of legend, these castles were not built to be pretty, they were built to last, built to outlast time itself. Castles were the product of an age that had seen civilizations rise and fall, where every lord or king needed to show that their power was not only established by birthright, but fortified with walls thick enough to withstand siege storms and the tests of time. Before there were modern mansion skyscrapers, or the opulent palaces of later periods, there were castles which defined both the military strategies and social hierarchies of the medieval world. These imposing stone structures were more than homes for the rich or powerful. They were symbols of dominance, security, and sometimes divine authority. But to understand why castles are so ingrained in our collective imagination, we must first understand the world they emerged from and the role they played in the ancient and medieval landscape. The castle was not simply a place where kings and queens resided. It was the very foundation of how power was perceived and maintained in a time before television, before air conditioning, before plumbing or indoor lighting. Castles were born from chaos, born in the ashes of Roman legions, crumbling into dust, and the dark centuries that followed in their wake. After the fall of this Roman Empire, Europe entered a period that historians often refer to as the Dark Ages. In this new world, chaos ruled the day. What had once been a network of roads, thriving trade, and centralized authority scattered across the Mediterranean world collapsed almost overnight. With the disintegration of the Roman order, Europe became a patchwork of feudal states, each lord, baron, and king looking after their own interests, struggling for land wealth and safety. During this time, peace was a luxury, not a reality. The very notion of security was shattered, and the world quickly became a place where survival took precedence over everything else. Amid this period of unrest, the first castles began to emerge. It was in these early structures, small, often temporary, wooden forts known as motte and bailey, that we see the beginning of a pattern that would define the rest of European history. Castles were not initially designed with comfort in mind, nor were they built to impress with architectural grandeur. Their purpose was more immediate and practical defense. But as time passed, these crude fortifications would evolve into the massive stone fortresses that we now associate with medieval life. At the heart of this evolution lies a shift in the very nature of warfare and power. Before the advent of castles, nobles and warlords had to defend their lands with little more than their armies and their personal strength. Fortifications were temporary, designed to withstand raids and invasions, but never to be truly impregnable. The ancient hill forts that dotted the landscape were as much a symbol of survival as they were practical shelters from attackers. But these forts, made from wood and earth, were easily burned to the ground by fire, a frequent weapon of those seeking to destabilize their enemies. They were only as strong as the soldiers guarding them, and only as durable as the weather permitted. This fragility was soon recognized, And from this instability, the first truly stone castles were born. If wooden fortifications could burn and rot, then surely stone could withstand such elemental forces. The problem, of course, was that stone was not a simple material to work with. Unlike wood, which could be felled, cut, and assembled in a matter of weeks, stone required an entirely different kind of labor, one that demanded both time and money, and a near constant supply of skilled laborers and masons. But for those who could afford it, stone was the perfect answer to the problems of the age. Stone didn't burn. Stone didn't rot. Stone sent a message louder than any army ever could. You cannot break me. The shift from wood to stone marked the beginning of the medieval arms race of fortifications. Lords, kings, and emperors began to build their castles with stone, not simply because it was practical, but because it was a statement of power, wealth, and permanence. In an age where life expectancy was short and the landscape was often ravaged by war and plagues, building something as permanent as a stone castle was the ultimate expression of a ruler's ambition. These castles were no longer mere homes. They were symbols of authority, of dominance, and perhaps most importantly, of security. But what makes the castle so iconic isn't just its durability. It's the way in which it embodies the paradox of the medieval world. On the one hand, these massive structures were designed to provide safety and stability. Fortresses meant to withstand the worst that nature and human conflict could throw at them. On the other hand, castles were also monuments to fear fortresses that reflected the deep anxiety of those who lived within their walls. The height of the towers, the thickness of the walls, the narrowness of the windows. All these elements of design were not merely aesthetic decisions, but calculated responses to the constant threat of invasion and the omnipresent fear of rebellion. The relationship between power, fear, and control is fundamental to understanding the lasting appeal of castles. These structures were designed not just to keep enemies out, but to project power in a world where might often made right. Lords and kings did not simply want their castles to protect them. They wanted them to be visible. A castle on a hill was not just a place to hide. It was a statement, a reminder that the ruler within was untouchable, watching over his people from on high. Castles were not only defensive, they were the medieval equivalent of a billboard for power. As the centuries passed, castles grew in complexity and scale. What began as a crude fortification became a labyrinth of stone towers, secret chambers, and fortified walls. With the rise of feudalism in the 10th and 11th centuries, the landscape of Europe was dotted with castles, each one a testament to the lord who had built it. These castles became the centers of power for local rulers, serving not only as fortresses, but as the heart of political life. Lords conducted business, dispensed justice, and maintained their authority from within the walls of their castles, which were often the only places of stability in a world beset by constant change. The sheer scale of some of these castles is a testament to the labor that went into their construction. The building of a castle was an enormous undertaking involving an army of workers, masons, laborers, and soldiers. These castles were not just for the elite, but for the very survival of the feudal order. In many cases, entire villages were built around these castles, providing the manpower and resources necessary for their construction and upkeep. A single castle could support hundreds of people, all of whom depended on it for their livelihood. Yet for all their grandeur and importance, castles were not invincible. They were constantly under threat from both invaders and nature. Wars, fires, and even the simple passage of time took their toll on these magnificent structures. Some were destroyed in sieges, others fell victim to the ravages of weather. And as the centuries passed and new technologies emerged, the role of the castle as a symbol of power began to fade. The rise of gunpowder cannons and modern siege tactics rendered the traditional castle's defenses obsolete. The very walls that once seemed impenetrable could now be breached with terrifying ease. In the end, the castle became something different, a romantic ruin, a relic of a time when the world was simpler and yet infinitely more violent. Today, we visit these castles as tourists marveling at their scale and beauty, unaware of the bloodshed, intrigue, and fear that once defined their existence. And yet, even in their ruin, these castles still stand as silent witnesses to the past, reminding us of the power, ambition, and paranoia that once shaped the medieval world. Section 1. From Rome's collapse to the Age of Walls. The fall of Rome was not merely the collapse of an empire, it was the shattering of the very idea of civilization as the people of the Mediterranean had known it. Like the sudden rupture of a mighty dam, the destruction of the Roman Empire released torrents of chaos that flooded the once peaceful landscape of Europe. What had been a unified, orderly expanse of roads, markets, and Roman legions protecting the peace dissolved into a wild, anarchic battleground where survival became the only law. For centuries, the Roman Empire had held sway over vast territories extending from the Iberian Peninsula to the sands of Egypt, from the wind-swept shores of Britannia to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. The Pax Romana, a period of relative peace under Roman rule, had allowed trade culture and cities to flourish. But when the empire fractured, that peace disintegrated into violence, instability, and fear. Without the central authority of the Roman legions to enforce order, bandits, marauding tribes, and warlords filled the vacuum. Raids became a way of life. The Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks rampaged across the former Roman provinces, burning villages, looting cities, and claiming land that had once been held under Roman governance. The imperial roads, which had once allowed quick movement of armies and commerce, now stood as deserted highways filled with the ghosts of traders who once passed freely. Roman villas, whose mosaic floors and marble columns had gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, now lay abandoned or destroyed. Cities once teeming with life became empty shells. The crumbling aqueducts no longer carried fresh water. The temples fell silent, no longer filled with the sounds of priests offering sacrifices to the gods. In the wake of the Roman collapse, the former citizens of this vast empire were left to face the elements of a new brutal world. This was the dawn of the so-called Dark Ages, but the truth was that life had become much darker than anyone could have predicted. There was no great war for the throne of Rome. There were no grand battles that could determine who would control the lands of the empire. Instead, it was 1,000 small battles fought in villages, fields, and the ruined remnants of Roman fortresses, each one over land, food, or the very right to survive. One of the most noticeable consequences of the fall of Rome was the collapse of hygiene and sanitation. The Romans had developed advanced systems for managing water sewage and public baths, but as their empire crumbled, so did the infrastructure that had once kept disease at bay. Without the knowledge or resources to maintain Roman aqueducts, people turned to more primitive means of obtaining water, and waste management became haphazard at best. Cities became breeding grounds for disease, and the Black Death, a century later, would show just how fragile the tenuous grip humanity had on health really was. In the countryside, this breakdown in sanitation was even worse. Farmers who once lived comfortably on the fertile lands of the empire were now at the mercy of unpredictable weather patterns, and the roads that had once connected the cities were now nothing more than dirt tracks. People in the rural areas lived in fear not just of raiders, but of sickness, which could strike without warning. With no real medical knowledge and few remedies beyond herbal potions and prayers, disease ravaged villages, wiping out entire populations in weeks. But the most pressing fear was not of sickness alone. It was the constant threat of attack. In this new world of fractured kingdoms and scattered tribes, everyone with a sword wanted land, and everyone with land wanted walls. The barbarian raids had shown how fragile life could be. Entire villages were burned to the ground in a single night, their inhabitants either killed or driven into the wilderness. To survive, people began to focus not on the comforts of Roman life, but on the most basic of needs, safety and security. Landowners who once lived in the comfort of Roman villas now realized that without protection, their land was nothing more than a piece of property ripe for the taking. Local warlords and chieftains began to amass small armies using whatever men they could recruit. The need to protect land from invaders and to assert dominance over the land one controlled became the driving force behind the construction of fortifications. These forts were crude at first, piles of wood and earth thrown together hastily to create a defensive perimeter, but they were effective enough to keep out raiders. The need for security grew so strong that the very landscape of Europe began to shift as more and more people looked for ways to defend themselves. This period of insecurity, this time when the very idea of peace seemed like a distant memory, is often referred to as the beginning of feudalism. Feudalism was a system that arose from the necessity of mutual protection. Kings who once ruled over vast empires found themselves powerless in the face of constant invasion. The Roman military apparatus was gone, replaced by small armies of knights, mercenaries, and peasants. Kings and lords no longer held dominion over the vast stretches of land they once controlled. They held power over the smaller, more manageable pieces of land that could be defended with soldiers. Feudalism was the solution to the problem of constant warfare and uncertainty. The king would grant land to a noble, and in return, that noble would provide soldiers to fight for the king when called upon. This system created an intricate web of loyalty debt and obligation, and at its center was the need for protection. It was a world where survival depended not on agriculture or trade, but on one's ability to defend and maintain one's holdings. In this new world of feudalism, the castle began to take shape. The need for walls and fortifications turned into a demand for something more permanent, something that could withstand not just raids, but also the passage of time. The idea of the castle as a permanent stronghold began to crystallize in the minds of the feudal lords. The land they held was no longer just a piece of real estate, it was a fortress, and that fortress needed to be defended at all costs. Thus, the age of castles was born, but these were not the grand, luxurious castles of later centuries. They were crude, functional, and designed for survival. The Motte and Bailey castles, with their wooden walls and raised earth mounds, were the first true castles of the post-Roman world. They were simple, and their design reflected the simple needs of the time, a place to retreat to when the world outside was too dangerous. The next step in castle design came when builders realized that wood, as sturdy as it might seem, was no match for the flames of a determined enemy. Wooden walls could be burned, and wooden keeps could be razed in the span of a few hours. But stone was different. Stone could endure. Stone could be shaped into walls so thick, so imposing, that not even the most persistent raider could breach them. And so, the stone castle was born. The first stone castles were crude, but effective, designed not for comfort, but for survival. They were dark, damp, and often uncomfortable, but they were also strong. The stone walls of these castles were not just symbols of power. They were practical barriers against a world filled with danger. In this new feudal order, everyone with a sword wanted land, and everyone with land wanted walls. Castles became the ultimate expression of feudal power. They were not just homes for the lord. They were his throne, his shield, and his statement of authority. Every stone that went into building a castle was a stone that said, "I own this land, and I am untouchable." Castles were not just fortresses. They were symbols of domination in a world where safety and security were the most valuable currency. It was in this world of constant warfare and shifting allegiances that the modern concept of the castle would begin to take shape. But the castles of this age were not the grand romantic ruins we see today. They were the fortress of the warlord, the king, the noble, and the merchant. They were structures built not for comfort, but for survival in an unforgiving world. And so in the midst of chaos, the castle became a beacon of hope for those who sought to survive in a world without the Roman order. It was a structure born out of necessity, but over time, it would evolve into something much more, a symbol of power, wealth, and control. The age of walls had begun. Section 2. Motte and Bailey. The first panic builds. In the aftermath of Rome's collapse, Europe found itself on the precipice of an unknown future. Once a continent united by the discipline of Roman law, the swaths of land once protected by the might of legions were now exposed. With the fall of Roman central authority came a surge of chaos, a sudden unraveling of the old world order, where plunder, pillaging, and survival were the primary concerns. People who had once enjoyed the relative peace of the Roman Empire were now trapped in a land where the very idea of safety was a fragile illusion. But amid this confusion and instability, a new kind of structure began to take shape, the Motte and Bailey Castle. At first glance, the Motte and Bailey was hardly the grand stone edifice we associate with castles today. It wasn't meant to impress with intricate designs, towering walls, or sprawling courtyards. It was at its core a practical solution, a patchwork fortification designed to answer the urgent needs of an uncertain world. The Motte and Bailey was essentially a fort built upon an artificial mound, a raised platform, or motte, constructed to give defenders an advantage over anyone trying to storm the fort. This was an age when the sight of an army on horseback charging through the plains could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The motte elevated a defensive structure high above the surrounding landscape, giving its defenders the ability to see enemies approaching from miles away. It was a simple but effective defense against surprise raids, allowing those inside to prepare long before the invaders reached their walls. Atop the motte sat a wooden fort, often a simple tower or keep, which served as the last line of defense. Surrounding this fortified mound was a bailey, a flat, open courtyard surrounded by wooden fences or walls. The bailey was used for living quarters storage and communal activities. It was the bustling center of daily life, while the motte remained a stronghold of defense. The motte and bailey design offered several key advantages that made it particularly appealing in an age of constant conflict. First and foremost, it was cheap. Wood, unlike stone, was readily available and could be quickly felled, cut, and assembled. The mound, often built with the labor of a few men, or even a small village, could be constructed with a fraction of the effort required for a stone foundation. In a time when resources were scarce and labor was even scarcer, the motte and bailey could be put up with remarkable speed. These castles were also relatively fast to construct. A lord with the resources to build a motte and bailey could have a working fortress in a matter of months, an impressive feat when compared to the years, or even decades, it took to build a stone keep. Time was often the enemy when it came to securing one's land, and in a world where any enemy could arrive at a moment's notice, a temporary but functional fortification was better than none at all. And perhaps most importantly, the motte and bailey had a psychological power far beyond its physical strength. It was, in essence, a visual statement of control designed to send a message to both allies and enemies alike. This land is mine, and I am prepared to defend it. The raised mound and wooden fort acted as a deterrent for the warlords and raiders who had lived their lives in a constant state of uncertainty. The sight of a fortress, even a simple one perched high on a hill, was a comforting symbol of permanence. It was a promise to the people within that they would not be easily overrun, and a warning to any who might dare challenge the fortress. Try and you'll find out the hard way why this hill is not so easy to climb. But for all its advantages, the motte and bailey castle was not without its flaws. Perhaps the most glaring of these was its material. Wooden walls, while cheap and quick to build, were equally quick to burn. A single well-placed torch could set an entire fortress ablaze, and the wind, which had once been a force that brought the scent of distant rain, could now carry fire to the heart of the fort with terrifying speed. The very material that made the motte and bailey so affordable also made it vulnerable to an enemy with the will to destroy it. The fortifications were also vulnerable to the elements. A wooden fort could be torn apart by a single storm. It could rot and decay, weakened by the constant cycles of rain and wind. The heat of summer and the cold of winter would cause the wood to expand and contract, eventually loosening the joints and weakening the walls. For all its advantages in construction speed, the motte and bailey was hardly a permanent solution. It was in many ways a temporary fix, built for immediate defense, but doomed to decay if left standing for too long. Perhaps the greatest flaw of all, though, was its lack of durability. The Motte and Bailey was a fortress built on the cheap, and it showed. Raiders who knew what they were looking for could quickly discover the weaknesses in its construction. It was no secret that wooden forts were highly flammable, and their defenses were often shallow and poorly maintained. Many Motte and Bailey castles were burned to the ground by rival lords or raiders who would take advantage of the weak wood to attack at night or during periods of rain. A fort that had taken months to build could be reduced to ashes in a matter of hours. To those who had once lived under the stability of Roman rule, the Motte and Bailey represented a false sense of security, a fragile barrier that would only last as long as the winds were favorable. As the decades passed, the limitations of the Motte and Bailey became more and more apparent. Lords began to realize that the fortifications they had built to protect their lands were in fact only temporary. The wooden structures were vulnerable to fire decay and destruction. Though they offered a sense of security, they were little more than a bandage on the deeper issue of survival in a world constantly at war. And so, as with all things in history, the Motte and Bailey evolved. The need for a more permanent solution was undeniable. Castles had to be built to last, not just for a few seasons, but for centuries. They had to endure not only the tests of fire, but the tests of time. And in this realization, a new era of castle building was born. The transition from Motte and Bailey fortifications to stone keeps would mark the beginning of a new era of architecture, one that would shape the future of Europe for generations to come. But before stone could replace wood, before castles could be built to withstand the siege engines and cannons of the future, the Motte and Bailey would have to serve its purpose in the immediate moment. Its cheapness, speed, and psychological power would continue to be valued for the time being, and it would serve as a stepping stone to something greater. In a world where survival often depended on the whims of weather, fire, and enemies, the Motte and Bailey stood as a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of a people who refused to give up on security. It was the first step in the long, arduous journey toward the castles we imagine today, those towering stone fortresses whose walls have withstood centuries of weather war and decay. But for all its imperfections, the Motte and Bailey was not a failure. It was the beginning of the castle-building tradition, the first sign that humanity could at least for a while hold on to something more permanent than the chaos around them. It was in the truest sense the first panic-driven attempt to build something that could survive the worst of the world. And though it was flawed, it was also, in its own way, a miracle of medieval construction. Section 3. The Stone Revolution Fortified Ego in Rock. In the cold, relentless winds of medieval Europe, the Motte and Bailey was merely a temporary solution to a much larger problem: survival in a world that seemed to be slipping further into chaos. While the wooden fortifications provided some semblance of protection against the ever-present threat of raids, the danger of fire and decay made them an unreliable safeguard against the more persistent enemies of the time. Castles, in the minds of those who lived in this age of uncertainty, needed to be more than temporary shelters. They needed to be permanent, impervious to the elements, and most of all, a statement of unyielding power. And so, the age of stone castles began. The transition from the humble wooden Motte and Bailey to the formidable stone keep was not just a technological leap forward. It was a radical shift in how people perceived strength, power, and control over the land they held. The choice to build with stone was more than practical. It was a symbolic act, a declaration that the old ways were no longer sufficient to withstand the new challenges of this chaotic age. The first stone castles, rough and rudimentary though they may have been, represented a dramatic departure from the flimsy wood and earth structures of the motte and bailey. Stone didn't burn. Stone didn't rot. Stone could withstand fire, weather, and even time itself. The very qualities that made stone the ideal material for castle construction also made it the perfect weapon in a political game where security was just as important as dominance. In a world where kings and lords sought to declare their divine favor and military superiority, the sight of a towering stone fortress was a message that could not be ignored. The psychological power of stone was immense. A wooden castle, for all its practical uses, was transient. It was vulnerable. Its towering walls could be destroyed by a single spark or the right wind. But a stone castle, massive, imposing, and permanent, was a fortress built not just for defense, but for intimidation. When a lord or king constructed a stone keep, they weren't just fortifying their land, they were asserting their power, their wealth, and their unwavering commitment to survival in a world where every border was contested and every alliance fragile. A stone castle was more than a symbol of military might. It was a beacon of divine favor. In an age where religion and power were often intertwined, stone was seen as a material that connected the earthly and the divine. The very act of building with stone was seen as an effort to align one's rule with the unshakable, eternal qualities of the heavens. Stone castles with their towering walls and imposing gatehouses were more than physical structures. They were spiritual assertions of power, a declaration that the Lord who owned them was above the petty struggles of everyday life and in control of not only his land, but his fate itself. But for all its advantages, the decision to build with stone came at a great cost. Stone did not come cheap. The labor required to build a stone castle was immense, and it was only possible with a small army of skilled masons, laborers, and artisans. Construction was slow and painstaking, unlike wood, which could be cut and assembled relatively quickly. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, and transported. A single stone might take days to carve into the right shape and even longer to transport across rugged terrain to the site of construction. The sheer scale of the work was staggering, requiring not just skilled craftsmen, but an army of workers to dig quarry and haul the materials needed for the job. Every stone placed, every wall built, was a testament to the labor that went into its construction. The process could take decades. The initial plans for a stone castle would be drawn up, and then over the course of many years, those plans would slowly become reality. Lords and kings would wait, sometimes impatiently, for their castles to rise from the earth, knowing that the stone walls would eventually offer the protection, security, and dominance they so desperately sought. But the years of waiting were not without their frustrations. Construction would halt during the winter months, as the ground froze and the masons could no longer work. The laborers, many of whom were little more than disposable workers, used and discarded once their work was done, suffered through brutal conditions as they carted stones through mud, rain, and snow. While the stone keep might have promised safety, security, and power, it was also a monument to the labor it took to build it. For those who worked on these castles, the sight of the fortress slowly taking shape was both a symbol of their toil and a reminder of their place in the feudal system. The lords and kings who owned the castles were the beneficiaries of the labor, but it was the workers, the masons, the quarrymen, the laborers who bore the true burden of the construction. Yet despite the hardships and the slow pace of construction, the stone castle represented an undeniable advancement in fortification design. As the castles grew in size and complexity, so too did the methods of warfare. Stone castles were built to withstand not just the simple raids of the early medieval period, but the siege engines and battering rams that would soon emerge as the primary tools of warfare. The simple wooden palisades of the motte and bailey were no longer sufficient. A stone castle, with its thick walls, high towers, and deep moats, was a fortress that could withstand not just fire, but the brutality of war. One of the most notable instances of the Stone Revolution came with the arrival of the Normans in England in 1066. After the famous Battle of Hastings, where William the Conqueror triumphed over King Harold, the Normans set about solidifying their hold on the newly conquered land. The Normans were masters of military strategy, and they knew that the best way to assert control over a hostile population was through the construction of castles' massive stone fortifications that would not only serve as military strongholds, but also as symbols of Norman rule. The explosion of stone castle construction in England was as much a political statement as a military necessity. William the Conqueror, in particular, saw the value of building castles as tools of occupation and intimidation. The rapid construction of castles across the country was a clear signal to the Anglo-Saxons. We are here to stay, and you will bow to us. The first wave of Norman castles was relatively simple in design, but as the centuries passed, the complexity of these fortresses grew. From the iconic motte and bailey castles built by the Normans, the designs evolved into grand stone fortifications that could withstand the most advanced siege tactics of the time. The sheer number of castles built by the Normans in England in the wake of the conquest was staggering. By the end of the 11th century, it is estimated that there were over 1,000 castles dotted across the English landscape, each one a testament to the power and reach of the Norman rulers. These castles were not just military strongholds, they were symbols of Norman dominance built to intimidate and control the population. The Normans understood the power of architecture in asserting authority, and they used their stone castles as a way to demonstrate their superiority over the Anglo-Saxons who had once ruled the land. The early stone castles were, by modern standards, often crude and uncomfortable. They were designed primarily for defense, not comfort. To keep the central structure of the castle was typically a dark, cold, and damp place where lords and their families lived in harsh conditions. There was little in the way of luxury or comfort. These were places of survival, not leisure. But the symbolism of the castle was what mattered. It was the fortification of power, the embodiment of a lord's control over his land and his people. And as the stone castles grew in size and complexity, they became more than just defensive structures. They became the physical representation of the feudal system itself, solid, unyielding, and inextricably tied to the social order. In time, The stone castle would become not just a symbol of military might, but a monument to feudal ego. The larger and more imposing the castle, the greater the perceived power of the lord who owned it. Castles were not merely designed to withstand sieges. They were designed to flaunt the wealth and power of those who built them. Each tower, each battlement, each wall was an assertion of authority, an attempt to carve one's dominance into the very landscape itself. The transition from wood to stone was not just an upgrade in terms of defense, it was a statement of permanence and dominance. Stone castles were no longer merely places of survival. They were monuments to the power of those who built them, designed not just to withstand attacks, but to intimidate, to declare, "I am here and I am untouchable." The Stone Revolution was not just an architectural change. It was the physical manifestation of feudalism itself, where power was built into the very land, and the walls of the castle were the walls of authority. And so the stone keel emerged from the ashes of a collapsed empire, rising like a mighty fist in the face of the chaos that had followed the fall of Rome. The Motte and Bailey had been a temporary fix, but stone was forever. It was a declaration that despite the collapse of the Roman order, the world would still be ruled by the strong, and the strong would be fortified in rock. The Stone Revolution was not just about building castles, it was about building power. Section 4. Castles as status symbols and social flexing. As the stone castles evolved from practical fortifications into monumental expressions of feudal power, their purpose began to shift in subtle yet significant ways. What had once been a matter of pure survival, walls thick enough to withstand battering rams and arrow volleys, transformed into a matter of appearance. The demands of defense, while still important, were no longer the sole focus. Now, lords and kings were not just concerned with surviving sieges. They were concerned with flaunting their power, their wealth, and their dominance over their rivals. A subtle, yet unmistakable shift occurred in the design of castles. The stark, utilitarian stone keeps that had once served as a symbol of military might were now adorned with intricate towers, elegant turrets, and grandiose gateways. Castles that had once been designed to simply keep invaders at bay were now designed to be monuments to their owner's ego. Lords began to see their castles not just as fortresses of survival, but as fortresses of prestige, a place where power could be literally carved into the landscape. It was a shift that would make modern people think of the castles as something akin to medieval Instagram, a means of broadcasting one's superiority to the world. Just as we use social media today to flaunt our wealth, success, and personal brand, medieval lords used their castles to project an image of strength, wealth, and social status. The towering keeps the elaborate gates, the multiple layers of fortifications, all of it was designed with an eye toward making a statement. These castles were more than places to live or defend. They were advertisements visible from miles away, broadcasting, "I am the most powerful, the most important, and the one to be feared." The larger and more imposing the castle, the greater the lord's perceived authority. This trend led to a kind of architectural arms race as lords began to compete with one another, not just to defend their lands, but to build the most extravagant, most terrifying, and most impressive fortress. Keep height, became a symbol of power, and the higher the keep, the stronger the Lord's image as a commanding force. Turrets, towers, and battlements stretched higher and higher, dwarfing the surrounding landscape as they reached for the sky, like concrete fingers pointing toward heaven. The taller the tower, the more intimidating the castle, and the more clearly the Lord was able to declare his dominion. These castles were not merely buildings, they were also statements of wealth. The stone and labor required to construct such structures were immense. The more intricate the design, the more costly the building project. Lords didn't just want to build to survive, they wanted to show that they could afford to spend lavishly on their fortresses. Towers were adorned with decorative features, Gothic arches, carvings, statues, and even battlements so finely detailed they looked like the work of artists more than soldiers. These were not just military defenses. They were works of art intended to make the owner look like not only a ruler of land, but also a patron of culture, power, and grandeur. In some ways, the construction of these extravagant castles was a way of competing for divine favor. The medieval world was a deeply religious place, where a lord's power was often seen as being sanctioned by God. A large, imposing castle, particularly one built on high ground or overlooking a valley, could be seen as a divine endorsement of the Lord's right to rule. Some even believed that the position and design of a castle could reflect their Lord's standing in the eyes of God. Castles that were more impressive, more grandiose, and more decorated could be interpreted as a sign that the Lord was blessed with divine favor, while those with smaller, less impressive keeps might be seen as somehow less worthy or less protected by God. But the race to outbuild one's rivals didn't always result in practical decisions, as castles became more about social status and less about defense aesthetic choices, often took precedence over functionality. Lords began to build castles, not in places where defense was easiest, but in places where they could be seen. The landscape, which had once been chosen for its strategic importance, its ability to defend and protect, was now chosen for its dramatic effect. Castles, perched on cliffs, built on swampy bogs, or located in flood zones, became common sights. It was as if the natural world itself had become an accessory to the Lord's ego, a way of showing that they could conquer even the most inhospitable landscapes. Castles on the edge of cliffs, for example, were not built because the terrain was particularly defensible. In fact, the sheer drop-offs made it difficult for defenders to operate efficiently, and the wind would often batter the castle with a force that made living conditions uncomfortable at best. But perched on these high points, the castle would dominate the land below, sending a clear message that the Lord who lived there was untouchable. The dramatic, even precarious placement of the castle made it seem as though the Lord could gaze down upon the world beneath him with divine authority. Similarly, building castles in bogs and flood zones created serious issues. The soft, shifting ground made it difficult to dig proper foundations. The likelihood of the ground eroding, causing the castle to sink, was high. But those risks mattered little compared to the psychological impact. To have a castle that seemingly defied the forces of nature itself was a testament to the Lord's resilience and power. The swamp The flooding rivers and the muddy earth beneath were all subordinate to the immovable stone walls and towering spires above. Such castles were like impossible visions made manifest, casting shadows over everything below and reminding the peasants and neighboring lords alike of the holder's superiority. In some cases, the aesthetics of a castle's location were prioritized to such an extent that they actually hindered the functionality of the fortress itself. Designers and builders became so focused on making the castle look as imposing and dramatic as possible that they forgot to consider more practical elements. Drawbridges became more elaborate not because they were needed for defense, but because they added an extra layer of grandeur. Spiral staircases wound unnecessarily tight, designed to slow down enemies, but also making life in the castle more difficult for its inhabitants. High, narrow windows, so small they resembled arrow slits, were chosen not for their practicality, but because they created a sense of mystery, a sense that the Lord within was untouchable, watching the world from behind a veil of secrecy. This obsession with decorative overkill didn't end with the walls and towers. The interiors of castles became just as extravagant as the exterior, with feasting halls designed to accommodate hundreds of guests, each with ornate tapestries hanging from the walls, massive stone fireplaces blazing in the center, and golden goblets filled with wine from the Lord's personal vineyards. These rooms were designed not for practicality, but for performance. Every meal, every banquet, and every assembly was an opportunity to showcase the wealth and power of the Lord to both allies and rivals. To the peasants who worked the land below, these lavish feasts were a reminder of how far removed they were from the world of their rulers. The obsession with status and ego-driven design also led to the creation of castles that defied logic. Some castles were constructed at great cost on the very edges of cliffs where their strategic value was limited, while others were built in floodplains where they were vulnerable to seasonal waters rising and washing away whole sections of the stone walls. Such decisions were driven by an aesthetic desire to impose one's will on the land, rather than a rational need for safety or military strength. Lords built these castles not because they were the most practical or defensible, but because they were the most dramatic, the most attention-grabbing. Every aspect of these fortresses was meant to project power and superiority, regardless of the dangers they presented. These were the first steps in what would become a long tradition of architectural self-aggrandizement, a culture where buildings were built not just to last, but to declare the worth of their owners. In time, castles would evolve to become even more grandiose, more defensive, and more strategic. But in their early form, they served as a symbol of the growing divide between the lord and the peasant, between the ruler and the ruled. Castles were no longer just about protection. They were about status, prestige, and an unspoken but powerful assertion of control. The Lord who built the highest, the most dramatic, the most beautiful castle was the Lord who commanded not just the land, but the very identity of those who lived on it. As this architectural arms race continued to escalate, the medieval landscape was reshaped by the ambition of those who sought to outdo their neighbors. Castles were built higher, larger, and more elaborately than ever before, transforming the landscape into a giant stage upon which the drama of feudal power was played out. The rivalry between lords became as much about which fortress could dominate the skyline as about which lord could conquer more land. And so, castles began to stand not only as bastions of defense, but as towering symbols of an era that was obsessed with ego status and the very visual representation of power. They were no longer just places to live or defend. They were the architectural manifestation of an age that could no longer separate ambition from the very land they held in their grasp. The landscape of medieval Europe was transformed not by armies or wars, but by the towering fortresses that reminded all who saw them of one immutable truth: power was something you could build and display for all to see. Section 5. The Castle on the Hill. Weaponized elevation. In the medieval landscape, it was not just the stone walls and towering keeps that commanded respect. There was another element less talked about, but perhaps even more powerful in its symbolism: the hill. It was the elevation of the land itself that gave castles their unparalleled dominance, transforming the very geography into a weapon of psychological warfare. The hill became a key ingredient in the medieval recipe for power, where its strategic advantages were only surpassed by the unspoken message it sent to all who gazed upon it: I am above you, and you will never reach me. The castle on a hill was not just a place of defense. It was a constant, visible reminder of the hierarchy that shaped the medieval world. Lords understood that position on the landscape was just as important as the fortifications that surrounded their castles. Elevation was power, and it was not by accident that so many of the grandest castles in Europe were built on hills, cliffs, and elevated ridges. They were the medieval equivalent of modern skyscrapers, visible from miles around, casting their long shadows over the peasants and villagers who lived below. The psychological effect of a castle perched atop a hill was profound. From its elevated vantage point, the lord in residence could survey all that lay beneath him: fields, villages, roads, and the homes of those who worked the land. The castle became a physical manifestation of control, not just over the land, but over the people who inhabited it. As the peasants went about their daily toil, their eyes were often drawn to the imposing silhouette of the castle on the hill, a constant reminder that their lives were shaped by the will of a lord who stood literally and figuratively above them. The hill provided a nearly unbeatable advantage in defense. The natural slope made it difficult for attackers to approach the castle gates without being noticed. As they climbed the hill, the forces of gravity acted as an unpaid bodyguard, forcing invaders to labor uphill, their energy drained with every step. The higher they climbed, the more exhausted they became, and by the time they reached the gates, they were already weak, demoralized, and ready to collapse. The castle's defenders, on the other hand, watched from above, poised to strike at any who dared make the arduous journey. It wasn't just the hill's elevation that made it so effective. It was the way it took advantage of the natural limitations of the human body. Gravity, always in motion, became an ally to the castle's defenders. Any attacker who attempted to scale the hill had to contend with the very weight of the earth itself, which worked against them at every turn. It was an exhausting process, especially for the soldiers burdened with armor, weapons, and the tools of war. Those attempting to storm the castle on a hill would find themselves out of breath, their muscles aching from the uphill slog before they even reached the gates. In many ways, the hill made the very act of attack a Herculean task. and one that often drained the invaders of their will long before the battle even began. But the hill was not only a weapon of defense, it was also a symbol of the unequal distribution of power. Lords built their castles on hills, not just because it was strategically advantageous, but because it allowed them to literally place themselves above the peasants. The peasants worked the land, tilled the soil, and labored in the fields below their backs, bent by the weight of their work. Above them, the castle sat on its hill, its towering walls and high spires commanding both the land and the people below. It was a physical expression of the rigid social hierarchy that dominated medieval life. The lord in his castle on his hill was always above the common people, both in position and in power. For the peasants, this daily reminder of their place in the social order was a constant source of frustration and perhaps resentment. Every time they looked up at the towering keep, they were reminded that they were at the mercy of the Lord who ruled over them. The castle on the hill was not just a structure, it was an ever-present symbol of feudal dominance. It represented not just military strength, but the unyielding authority of the Lord and the clear division between those who wielded power and those who were subject to it. Yet, for all the psychological and strategic advantages that came with building a castle on a hill, the process of constructing such a fortress was far from easy. The very same elevation that made the castle a powerful weapon against invaders made it a miserable burden for those tasked with building it. The labor required to haul stone timber and supplies uphill was brutal, and the construction of the castle became a grueling, never-ending struggle against the forces of nature. The builders, often peasants or laborers who were conscripted into the work, would have to contend with the sheer physical difficulty of the task. Stones had to be quarried from the surrounding landscape and then transported up the steep slopes to the castle site. The workers would labor in shifts hauling the heavy stones and materials with carts, oxen, and sometimes even by hand. Every stone carried up the hill was a testament to the brutal nature of the task, and the workers, often anonymous in the grand scheme of history, would spend days, weeks, and even months hauling stone, brick, and mortar up the treacherous slopes. The animals that were enlisted to help with the construction, too, suffered from the elevation. Oxen, horses, and donkeys were used to carry materials, but the steep incline took its toll on them as well. They would struggle under the weight of their burdens, their hooves slipping on the loose gravel, their bodies straining against the difficult terrain. For the animals, as for the workers, the castle on the hill was a constant reminder of the pain and hardship that went into the creation of these grand fortresses. And then there were the servants, those who lived in the castles once they were built. For them, life on the hill was no less difficult. Though they were protected from the dangers of the outside world, they were also subjected to the harsh conditions that came with living in such a remote, elevated location. The cold winds that howled across the hilltop, the dampness of the stone walls, and the isolation from the rest of the world made life inside the castle a constant battle against discomfort. The servants, who were often tasked with fetching supplies, preparing food, and maintaining the castle's defenses, would have to contend with the same uphill climbs that the laborers had once faced. There was no escaping the reality of the hill. The Lord's power was always inescapably above them, and their lives, though lived in relative safety, were still marked by the labor and suffering that went into maintaining such a fortress. The castle on the hill also became a powerful tool of intimidation, not just for invaders, but for the very people who lived within its shadow. Lords understood the power of visibility. The sight of a castle looming above the villages and fields below was a constant reminder of who held the power. The peasants who saw the castle daily would be reminded of their subjugation by the sheer presence of the castle. It was a silent weapon, a weapon that used geography and elevation to ensure that the Lord's authority was never questioned. The Lord's gaze was always upon them from the top of the hill, watching over the land with a cold, calculating eye. But perhaps the most psychological weapon of all was the sheer difficulty of reaching the castle. An attacker, weary from the exhausting climb, would already be at a disadvantage before even facing the castle's defenders. The castle's location on a hill was a physical barrier to entry. It was not just a fortress in the traditional sense. It was a barrier to power, a tangible obstacle that separated the rulers from the ruled. To climb the hill, to approach the gates of the castle, was to climb towards power itself, and to fail in that climb was to remain forever beneath it. The castle on the hill was not just a fortress, it was a fortress with purpose. It was a weapon, a psychological tool that wielded its elevation as both a physical barrier and a social statement. It was a daily reminder that power like gravity was relentless and inescapable. Those who lived beneath the shadow of the castle on the hill would never be free from the gaze of the Lord above them. And the physical struggle to reach the gates of that castle was just as much a struggle for power as it was for survival. The builders and the servants, the peasants and the lords, they all knew the reality of the hill. For the peasants, it was a source of frustration and resentment. For the lords, it was a symbol of dominance and control. And for the invaders, it was an insurmountable challenge that often led to exhaustion, failure, and death. In the end, the castle on the hill was more than just a structure. It was a weapon wielded by the elite to remind the world below who held the power. Section 6. The Moat. Europe's biggest, muddiest flex. If the castle on the hill was a towering display of dominance over the land, the moat was a watery counterpart, a massive, grim, and often foul symbol of separation, both physical and psychological. Castles, after all, were not just designed to keep enemies out. They were designed to instill fear, to make an invader's assault seem so impossible that even the thought of attacking was enough to turn them away. The moat, like the walls and towers it encircled, was part of the castle's psychological weaponry, meant to break an attacker's spirit before the first arrow was even shot. The concept of the moat, those deep, often murky trenches filled with water stretching around the base of a castle like an unnavigable wound, was rooted in practicality. On paper, the moat served an important function. It was meant to act as a formidable barrier, preventing siege towers from being wheeled to the castle's walls and making it impossible for ladders to reach high enough to allow attackers to climb over the battlements. The water was intended to slow the approach of enemy soldiers, forcing them to either swim through or find some other means of crossing, both of which would make them easy targets for the defenders above. If the moat was wide enough, it would also stop battering rams' large siege weapons from getting close enough to the walls to cause any real damage. But as with most things in the medieval world, the reality of the moat was far less romantic than its purpose might suggest. To begin with, Moats were rarely as clean and pristine as one might imagine. The water that filled them often came from nearby river streams, or even rainwater collected from the roofs of the castle itself. But even this water quickly became stagnant, fouled by debris, dead animals, and the sheer number of human bodies it had to accommodate. There was no such thing as filtration systems, and no one had the resources or knowledge to keep such an expanse of water from stagnating. The result was often a thick, sludgy mess of murk and decay. For the people who lived within the castle's walls, the moat was a disgusting, ever-present reminder of the hardships of medieval life. Even the defenders, who relied on it for protection, had to contend with its foulness. The smell alone was enough to make anyone recoil. It wasn't just the stench of rotten vegetation and stagnant water, but the overpowering odors of dead fish animal carcasses, and in some cases, the bodies of those unfortunate enough to fall into the moat during an attack. If the water was not regularly replenished or cleaned, things that were rare in the medieval world, the moat quickly turned into a cesspool. The surface would often be covered with algae or scum, a greasy film that kept everything beneath the water hidden from view. And then there were the bugs. Flies, mosquitoes, and other insects thrived in the fetid waters, laying eggs in the rotting organic material that accumulated at the bottom of the moat. For the inhabitants of the castle, this meant an endless war against biting pests. Even those inside the walls, safe from attackers, could not escape the irritations and diseases brought by the insects. The moats, while supposed to protect them, often delivered a very different form of suffering. The animals, too, were frequent casualties of the moat. Livestock, particularly cattle, sheep, or horses that strayed too close to the edge of the water, often met tragic ends. The steep banks, the slippery mud, and the treacherous waters were dangerous even for the most sure-footed animals. If they lost their footing and fell into the moat, it wasn't always easy to rescue them. Even if they managed to survive the fall, they often became stuck in the muck, drowning, or succumbing to exhaustion in the thick, sticky water. Horses essential to the workings of a medieval castle were often the worst casualties of all. Their large bodies would sink into the swampy depths, and it was no easy task to retrieve them. For the people of the castle, the moat's water meant to protect them from invasion became another less visible enemy, the slow but inevitable erosion of resources. While the idea of a water-filled moat was enticing in theory, its reality left much to be desired. Many castles, especially the older ones, ended up with moats that were more trouble than they were worth. Some became dry, filled only with mud rocks and debris as the water levels drained away, or as local resources ran dry. These dry moats, rather than acting as watery barricades, were often filled with spikes, jagged rocks, or other painful obstacles designed to injure and dissuade attackers. The dry moat, with its jagged edges and pointy implements, was an equally impressive psychological deterrent. Imagine an attacking force, already exhausted from their long march, their minds weary with the stress of preparing for battle. They reach the base of the castle, only to find themselves faced with a wide, impassable trench filled with an array of sharp objects, wooden stakes, rocks, or even broken glass. The purpose of this dry moat was simple, a reminder of the hardships ahead. It was meant to keep invaders from even thinking about trying to cross. More often than not, attackers would simply turn away demoralized by the sudden realization that they would have to scale yet another obstacle just to begin their assault on the castle. Some castles went even further, creating double moats, two wide, intimidating trenches that flanked the castle's walls. The first moat would be the primary line of defense, but the second would be deeper, broader, and even more difficult to cross. It would be as if the Lord was saying, "If you think you've reached the end, think again." Double moats were another layer of defense, designed to stretch the enemy's patience and resources, forcing them to exhaust their strength in navigating the gaps between the two barriers. For those few who made it across the first moat, they still had to contend with the second. These barriers weren't just physical. They were barriers to morale, to hope, to any sense of accomplishment. But for all their grand design and intimidating appearance, the moat was never truly the ultimate barrier. It was a form of defensive landscaping, an aesthetic choice that looked far more impressive on paper than in practice. Yes, it discouraged some attacks, but it was not a perfect system. The same rains that filled the moat could also flood it, making it more difficult for defenders to keep the water at the right levels. Stagnation was always an issue, and the buildup of debris often rendered the moat useless for its intended purpose. At times, it was not the invading force that fell victim to the moat, but the castle itself. If the water wasn't maintained, the moat could become nothing more than a glorified pond, its defenses as inadequate as a wooden fence. Even so, the moat's psychological power was undeniable. It was theater on a massive scale. For the attacker, the mere sight of the moat, the very idea of it, was enough to create hesitation. The moat was not merely a physical obstacle. It was a symbol of the castle's absolute dominance over the landscape. It was Europe's biggest, muddiest flex, a way for lords to say to their enemies, "Before you even reach my walls, you must overcome nature itself." The moat, with its stagnant water mud and muck, was an embodiment of the medieval worldview. It was a place where the brutal forces of nature, feudal hierarchy, and the whims of those in power all came together in a single oppressive package. It wasn't just about defense. It was about making a statement that would echo across the centuries, reminding those who saw it that power was not just about what you could conquer, but about what you could make others struggle to reach. In the end, the moat was more than a defensive feature. It was a psychological game, a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon in war isn't a sword or a shield. Sometimes it's the mere idea of impossibility. The moat worked because it made the attackers believe they couldn't win. And in that belief, the battle was half lost before it even began. Section 7. The Gatehouse Murder. Disguised as hospitality. There are few architectural features in the medieval world as chillingly brilliant as the gatehouse. It was in many ways the first line of defense, not just physically, but psychologically as well. The gatehouse was the quintessential example of hospitality in the medieval fortress, a seemingly welcoming entrance that invited visitors into the warmth and protection of the castle. But underneath the grandeur of banners, drawbridges, and welcoming architecture lay a far darker truth. The gatehouse was not a passage into safety, it was the gateway to death. The gatehouse's design was a work of deceit and cruelty, a masterpiece of architectural trickery that promised entry, but ultimately delivered doom. To any would-be invader, the first impression was one of open arms, at least on the surface. The drawbridge was lowered. The banners flew proudly in the wind, and the wide gates stood open. To the enemy, it looked like a path to victory, a gateway to the heart of the castle. But what lay beyond was not an open welcome. It was a carefully crafted trap, disguised as hospitality. The mechanism of the kill zone was ingenious in its simplicity. The invader, having successfully crossed the moat, whether by luck, skill, or sheer willpower, would find themselves greeted by a narrow tunnel. This seemingly innocuous passage was the perfect site for a lethal surprise. At first glance, the tunnel appeared to be nothing more than a simple corridor leading to the castle's interior. But in reality, it was a death trap, a kill zone designed to take advantage of every military weakness an attacker could possess. Once the invaders stepped inside, they were no longer in control. As the first intruders made their way across the drawbridge, the portcullis, a heavy iron grate, would suddenly drop, with a deafening crash trapping them in the narrow corridor. These portcullises, often made of iron or wood and reinforced with spikes, were not merely a physical barrier. They were a psychological one, symbolizing finality. There was no going back. The attacking force was now isolated in a tiny, confined space where they could neither retreat nor advance without facing certain death. Above them, suspended in the cold shadows of the gatehouse, were the murder holes, gaps in the ceiling through which defenders could pour boiling oil pitch or even stones down onto their helpless victims below. The narrowness of the tunnel ensured that anyone trapped inside would be vulnerable to attack from above. From this position, defenders could rain down death with impunity, using whatever they had on hand to disable, maim, or kill their enemies. The attackers, meanwhile, were powerless at the mercy of the defenders, who controlled the tunnel and the gatehouse. It wasn't just boiling oil that could be poured down upon the attackers. Arrows and crossbow bolts could also be fired through the narrow arrow slits that lined the walls of the tunnel. These slits were perfectly designed to allow defenders to fire their weapons while remaining hidden, protected by the thick stone walls of the gatehouse. From the safety of their vantage point above, they could pick off attackers one by one as they struggled to make their way down the passage. The narrowness of the tunnel meant that only a few attackers could advance at a time, and in such close quarters, they would be easy targets. To make matters worse, many gatehouses were over-engineered with multiple layers of defenses, ensuring that once the invader had crossed the first threshold, they would find themselves faced with even more obstacles. Some castles boasted several gates, each one fortified, and designed to add another layer of difficulty to the attack. The first portcullis would fall, trapping the invaders in the kill zone, but they would still face another set of gates before they could enter the heart of the castle. With each successive gate, the attackers would be forced to fight their way forward, only to be met with another obstacle, and another, and another. This over-engineering made the gatehouse even more lethal. After the first wave of attackers was trapped in the tunnel, defenders could operate in relative safety, knowing that the layers of defense would prevent any quick reinforcements from arriving. Any soldiers attempting to rush to the aid of their comrades would have to fight their way through another set of barriers, slowing them down and weakening their morale. It was a cruel, calculated game of attrition that wore down even the most determined of foes. Some castles, particularly those built by lords who were paranoid or simply had too much time and money on their hands went so far as to create double drawbridges and double gates. The first drawbridge would lead into a courtyard, but the attackers would soon find that their hopes of victory were dashed when they reached the second set of gates, where yet another portcullis awaited them. This extra layer of defense was not just for physical protection, it was a psychological weapon. It ensured that attackers would feel their progress being constantly thwarted, driving home the hopelessness of their situation. Even the guards who manned these fortifications were caught up in the theater of death that the gatehouse created. For the guards, the gatehouse was not just a place of duty, it was their home, their workplace, and sometimes their trap. The guards lived above the kill zone, above the narrow tunnels and deadly contraptions, safe in the knowledge that they were hidden from view. But this luxury came at a price. The gatehouse was not just a space for defense. It was a place of vigilance and constant readiness. The guards were often on duty around the clock, watching for any signs of movement, any attempt by invaders to breach the gates. Their job was one of constant alertness, knowing that if the attackers broke through, they would be the first line of defense. At times, this meant that the guards had to live in conditions that were hardly comfortable. Above the murder corridors, they might sleep in cramped rooms where the constant clanging of the portcullis or the sounds of arrows raining down below kept them in a state of constant vigilance. It wasn't unusual for the guards to have to stay alert for days at a time, eating, sleeping, and living in the cramped, uncomfortable spaces above the gates, waiting for the next wave of attackers to come. Their lives were as much a part of the castle's defenses as the portcullis itself. Yet despite the brutality and horror of the gatehouse, it was also a place of great prestige for the lord who controlled it. The gatehouse was a symbol of the Lord's power, a reminder to all who entered that their safety and their life was controlled by the Lord who owned the castle. The drawbridge was raised at the Lord's whim, and the gates were opened only to those who were worthy of entering. The gatehouse in this way was a public display of authority, a way of reminding everyone, whether guest or enemy, that the Lord's rule was absolute. In its most extreme form, the gatehouse became a place of ritualized violence, where attackers were not just defeated, but humiliated. The entrance to the castle, the place that should have symbolized welcome, became the site of suffering and death. The lords knew that by controlling the gatehouse, they controlled not just the castle, but the very fate of those who tried to enter. And for the defenders, who spent their lives working in the shadows of the murder holes and arrow slits, the gatehouse was a silent witness to the violence of their time, a place where life and death were separated by the thinnest of margins. Section 8. Diabolical Design. Stairs, arrow slits, keeps, and curtain walls. In the medieval castle, there was a distinct and deliberate purpose behind every design choice, a careful calculation of how to convert the art of defense into the most impenetrable form of psychological warfare. It wasn't just about strength or brute force. It was about crafting an environment that would work often cruelly against the very people who dared to approach. The elements of a castle's design, from spiral staircases to arrow slits, curtain walls, to keeps, all had their part to play in the fortress's ruthless functionality. Perhaps no feature of medieval architecture is as iconic or as insidious as the spiral staircase. To modern eyes, spiral staircases are elegant, graceful, a charming quirk of old castles. But for the invader, the spiral staircase was nothing short of a weapon, built to serve a singular purpose, preventing invaders from successfully climbing into the keep. The staircase, like so many features in medieval fortifications, was engineered with meticulous cruelty. The design of the staircase was dictated not by aesthetics, but by its defensive capabilities. The stairs spiraled clockwise, favoring the defender's right arms, meaning any attacker attempting to ascend the staircase would find their sword arm constrained by the central column. They would be forced into an awkward position, their right arm pinned, while the defenders above them had free range to strike without such limitations. Every turn of the staircase worked against the attacker. The uneven steps, some high, some low, further ensured that only those who were well prepared and well trained could ascend without stumbling. The lack of symmetry, designed to disrupt the rhythm of an advancing force, was a deliberate effort to put invaders off balance and slow their progress. A staircase that twisted, contracted, and made progress more difficult would break the will of any would-be conquerors long before they reached the top. The narrowness of the spiral itself was another key detail in the castle's diabolical design. It was difficult enough to ascend the stairs while dealing with the awkwardness of an imbalanced climb. But the limited space in the staircase meant that invaders could only advance one by one. This would prove fatal in the heat of a battle. A single, well-placed defender at the top of the staircase could easily cut down a series of attackers as they struggled to pass through the cramped, twisting shaft. A band of soldiers, once united in their attempt to breach the castle, was reduced to nothing more than a group of individuals trapped in a bottleneck and vulnerable to swift elimination. But the spiral staircase was just the beginning. The true genius of medieval defense lay in the way castles incorporated every element of design to maximize their military advantage. Another feature that helped fortify the castle and contributed to its terror was the arrow slit. These narrow, seemingly insignificant openings in the walls might seem innocuous at first glance, but their purpose was nothing less than mastery over the art of war. Arrow slits were designed with deadly precision, serving as both practical and psychological weapons. From the outside, the slits were narrow and tiny, so thin that a single person would barely be able to see through them. But on the inside, the slits were wider, offering archers a large field of vision and allowing them to fire arrows with deadly accuracy, all while remaining nearly invisible to the enemy. The evolution of these arrow slits was part of the ongoing arms race between defense and attack. In the early days of castle construction, these slits were often nothing more than simple vertical cuts in the stone, thin enough to prevent an enemy from shooting back. But as siegecraft evolved and new methods of attack became more sophisticated, so too did the design of the arrow slits. Some were widened and made cross-shaped to accommodate crossbows, allowing defenders to fire from a more versatile position. Others took on more specialized shapes designed for early firearms, and sometimes even angled to allow archers to target specific approach routes, making it nearly impossible for attackers to hide from their arrows. The evolution of arrow slits mirrored the ongoing battle for supremacy between attackers and defenders. It wasn't just about making the walls thicker or the defenses higher. It was about exploiting every gap in the defense, every slight advantage. Arrow slits were the means by which a few determined defenders could hold off dozens or even hundreds of attackers, carefully targeting any who dared to approach the wall. And then, at the heart of every castle, stood the keep. The keep was the ultimate expression of a medieval lord's power, thick-walled, impenetrable, and designed to withstand even the most desperate siege. When everything else failed, the keep was the last refuge. In times of peril, when the castle's outer defenses had been breached and invaders were within sight of the inner walls, the lord and his retinue would retreat into the keep. This was where the last stand would be made, and the keep was designed to make that final stand as formidable as possible. Its walls were thick, so thick that attackers had little hope of breaking through them. These walls were built with layers of stone so heavy and solid that they were effectively impervious to any siege weaponry of the time. But while the keep offered unparalleled protection, it also had its own set of brutalities. It was cold, damp, and often poorly ventilated. The lack of privacy combined with the constant fear of imminent attack created a tense atmosphere. The rooms within the keep were cramped with narrow corridors and staircases, all designed to maximize defense, but at the expense of comfort. The lord and his family would be holed up in these dreary quarters, living in a state of perpetual readiness, where every creak of the walls and every shift in the atmosphere was a potential sign of impending doom. There was no luxury in the keep, just the grim knowledge that survival was the only priority. The keep was in essence a survival machine, a last bastion where everything from food to weapons to living spaces was crammed into a small, cold fortress of stone. The only warmth would come from small fireplaces barely able to heat more than a few feet of space around them. The fires themselves could be more dangerous than comforting, as the smoke would often fill the room, making breathing difficult. The ever-present dampness clung to the stone walls, and even the most well-protected room in the castle would seem forever chill. This was the price of security, solitude, discomfort, and constant anxiety. For the lord and his family, the keep was not just a place of defense, it was a place of isolation, a constant reminder of the precariousness of power. Even in the most fortified of castles, a lord's reign could collapse if the keep fell. The walls might be thick enough to withstand arrows, but they could not protect against the crushing weight of fear and doubt that came with the knowledge that any moment could be the one when the walls were breached. Beyond the keep, the castle's exterior was also fortified with the infamous curtain walls, a system of barriers designed to create multiple layers of defense, each one more difficult to breach than the last. The curtain wall was a long, continuous perimeter wall that wrapped around the castle like a massive stone snake. These walls were often punctuated with towers and fortified gates, each one a strategic point where defenders could hurl arrows, boiling oil, or stones at any attacker who got too close. The curtain wall's strength lay in its simplicity. It was designed not just to repel attackers, but to isolate them. Once an enemy breached the outer walls, they would find themselves trapped in the courtyard, surrounded by the massive walls and deadly towers with nowhere to hide. The spacing of the towers along the curtain wall was a critical feature of this design. Every tower was carefully placed to ensure that there were no blind spots, no areas where attackers could sneak past. The towers were positioned at strategic intervals, allowing defenders to maintain a constant line of sight across the entire perimeter. Any movement outside the walls could be spotted any approach to the gates anticipated. The idea was that no matter where the enemy came from, there was always someone watching. The angles of the curtain walls were no less deliberate. Sloped at their bases, These walls made it more difficult for attackers to use siege engines like battering rams or trebuchets. The angle caused the weight of the machines to slip off, rendering them ineffective. The design was a masterstroke of medieval engineering. Every feature, every inch of the castle's layout was crafted with an eye toward one-thing defense. But as with all things in medieval warfare, these defenses came at a steep price. The labor required to build the curtain walls was monumental. Entire generations of peasants were conscripted into the effort, forced to work for their lords, hauling stones and timber up hills, constructing a fortress that would stand for centuries to come. The sheer weight of the work, combined with the labor needed to transport and position thousands of tons of stone, ensured that the construction of a castle was as much a feat of endurance as it was of architectural genius. And yet, for all their strength and grandeur, the curtain walls were not invulnerable. Time and again, invaders would learn that no defense, no matter how seemingly impenetrable, could withstand the relentless evolution of siegecraft. The curtain walls, which had once been the ultimate symbol of military might, would eventually be broken down by the increasing sophistication of weapons and tactics. The castles that had once been the kings of the battlefield would eventually become relics of a bygone age, reminders of the fear, the paranoia, and the genius that went into creating them. In the end, the walls that were designed to keep the enemy out became symbols of the very human frailty they were built to protect against. They were a reminder that no matter how thick or tall the walls were, the human spirit was always susceptible to the creeping decay of time, the shifting tides of history, and the inevitable collapse of even the most fortified empires. In this way, the design of the medieval castle, the stairs, the arrow, slits, the keeps, and the curtain walls, was a reflection of the medieval worldview, that power was fragile and survival required not just strength, but constant vigilance. Each stone, laid each tower, constructed each wall built, was an act of defiance against time itself. And yet, in the end, it was time that had the final word. The castles, built to stand for eternity, eventually crumbled, just as all empires do. But as long as the stones remained standing, they whispered the same message. We were here, and we endured. Section 9. The siege, science, spite, and very slow misery. The siege, the very word, sends a shiver down the spine, evoking images of endless struggle, drawn-out warfare, and a kind of miserable perseverance that outlasts even the bravest of hearts. It was the test of all medieval defenses, where stone met fire, steel met wood, and willpower met the long, slow crush of time. The siege was never about quick victories or glorious moments of valor. It was about attrition, the wearing down of both the body and the spirit, until the defenders either surrendered or died. Early sieges were more an exercise in bad ideas, feeble attempts to breach walls with crude, often comical tactics that rarely worked. But over time, the art of siegecraft evolved into something more methodical, more sophisticated, and certainly more horrifying. Initially, when attackers first began to lay siege to castles, they relied on simple yet ineffective methods. Ladders were the first tool of the would-be conqueror, a crude but reliable attempt to scale the walls. The basic concept was simple enough. Place a ladder against the wall, climb it, and leap into the castle. It sounds straightforward, even innocuous, but it was far from an elegant solution. The first flaw of the ladder was its lack of subtlety. The moment a ladder was placed against the castle wall, everyone inside knew exactly what was coming. There was no element of surprise, and while the attackers might have hoped to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers, the lack of protection or surprise made it an incredibly risky and largely fruitless tactic. As soon as the ladder touched the wall, defenders could rain arrows, rocks, or boiling liquids down upon the unfortunate souls who attempted to ascend. The ladder, while it might have seemed like a practical solution, quickly became the laughingstock of siege tactics. There was little science, no calculation, no real strategic thinking behind its use, just an attempt to scale a wall that usually ended in failure. Ladders could not bear the weight of large forces, and once in place, the attackers were just sitting ducks. If there was one thing the medieval castle had in abundance, it was the ability to make those who attempted to scale its walls regret it bitterly. As siege tactics evolved, so did the tools of war. The latter gave way to more engineered methods. The simplicity of a ladder was replaced by more thought-out machines, driven by momentum and mathematics, turning the tide of siegecraft into a battle of both brawn and brains. The trebuchet and battering ram emerged as the dominant machines of destruction, transforming the pace of sieges from chaotic skirmishes into long, drawn-out sieges that could last weeks, months, or even years. Trebuchets, in particular, were the epitome of siege weaponry. The ingenuity behind these machines was extraordinary, a combination of simple physics and sheer engineering force. Using a large arm, a counterweight, and a sling, the trebuchet could hurl massive projectiles, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, at the walls of a castle, with terrifying accuracy. These projectiles could include large stones burning tar, or even diseased corpses, meant to not only batter down the castle's defenses, but to demoralize and sow fear among the defenders inside. The sheer momentum of the trebuchet's swing made it a weapon capable of causing immense damage, tearing through walls, and leaving gaping holes that defenders could not repair fast enough. Battering rams, on the other hand, were the more brutal and direct tool of siegecraft. These massive logs, often reinforced with metal at the tip, were swung against gates and walls with all the force of a wrecking ball. They were slow, ponderous devices, requiring many men to operate them, but they were effective. The battering ram's success was rooted in sheer, unrelenting force designed to break down doors and gates bit by bit, inch by inch. And much like the trebuchet, it wasn't just the physical damage that mattered. The battering ram instilled fear, grinding down the resolve of defenders who knew that with every blow, their defenses were becoming weaker. However, the problem with both the trebuchet and the battering ram was that they were slow. They required time to set up and to operate. A trebuchet, especially the larger versions, took hours to prepare, and fire and battering rams were cumbersome to move and use, requiring men to stay under constant threat from the defenders. Siege warfare by nature was a drawn-out affair. It was not a battle of quick clashes, but one of patience and sustained pressure. The enemy outside was rarely defeated by a single mighty blow. The walls might withstand days or weeks of bombardment before the defenders started to feel the weight of hunger and despair. And that was where the true horror of a siege lay. While the machines of war did their work swinging, battering, and hurling destruction inside the castle, a different kind of battle was taking place. The defenders, cut off from supplies, were beginning to feel the harsh bite of starvation. Water, food, and fresh supplies were running low, and morale was plummeting. The agony of a siege was not just about fighting, it was about waiting. Waiting for the walls to fall, waiting for the attackers to finally breach the gates. But more than anything, it was waiting for hunger and disease to take their toll. As the siege wore on, defenders would try to hold on to their morale with whatever scraps of hope they could find. Some would pray. Some would use what little food they had left to break the monotony, eating in silence as the sounds of the battering ram echoed outside. Inside the castle, there was no glory, no moments of heroism, just cold, cramped spaces filled with fear. The horrors of a siege were not written in glorious battles, but in the slow, grinding suffering of a besieged people. To combat the effects of hunger, defenders would often turn to any means of securing food they could find, even resorting to eating the castle's livestock or the pets that might have once been cherished companions. The situation could become so dire that soldiers and civilians alike would suffer from malnutrition, leading to a weakening of their resolve and their ability to fight. Disease would soon follow, spread by the rats that took over the castle's increasingly unsanitary conditions, carrying with them plagues and illnesses that further drained the defenders' strength. On the attacking side, things were equally difficult. A siege wasn't an isolated experience for the defenders, it was a torment for the attackers too. It might have seemed like they had the upper hand with their trebuchets and battering rams breaking down walls and sending projectiles flying, but they too were under constant pressure. They were outside the safety of their castle, exposed to the elements and the dangers of war. In addition to facing the ever-present threat of death from the defenders' arrows or boiling oil, the attackers had to deal with the realities of long-term camp life. Constant hunger, disease, and discomfort plagued them just as it did the besieged, though with a different twist. The attackers were far more vulnerable to morale breakdowns, as their victory felt so far out of reach, and the resources to sustain a long siege could quickly run low. But the longer the siege went on, the more that psychological warfare took precedence. The waiting, the uncertainty, the feeling that this battle would never end, it wore on everyone. Inside the castle, defenders grew weaker, their food stores dwindling. Outside, the attackers began to feel the slow weight of frustration, as the siege seemed to drag on with no resolution. As the days turned into weeks, then months, both sides grew more desperate. And it was during these times, when all the grand machines and defenses had been exhausted, that the true nature of the siege revealed itself not in battle, but in the erosion of spirit. In the long, grinding weeks of a siege, it wasn't the physical prowess of the combatants that decided the outcome, it was the will to survive. When food ran out and diseases began to fester, it was no longer about who was stronger or who had the better weapons. It became about who could hold on the longest, who could endure the slow misery of hunger, disease, and despair. In many ways, the siege was a battle not of armies, but of wills. Those who gave in to fear, to hunger, or to the knowledge that there was no escape would be the first to fall, whether by surrender, desertion, or death. The defenders might die at the gates, but the attackers would just as often die from within, tired, hungry, broken by the relentless march of time and misfortune. In the end, the true horror of the siege was that it wasn't just about walls or weapons. It was about the slow, grinding agony of survival, the torment of watching your resources run out, your strength wither away, your hope drain from your bones. Hunger would kill you quicker than any sword. Boredom would destroy your spirit faster than any trebuchet. And it was this prolonged, sustained misery, the endless days of struggle, of waiting, of grinding attrition, that made the siege the most diabolical and merciless form of warfare that the medieval world could conceive. It wasn't the machines of war that brought the castle down. It was the passage of time, the patience of hunger, and the erosion of hope. Section 10. Life inside cold smoke, noise, and luxury. When we think of the medieval castle, we often imagine towering stone walls, impenetrable fortifications, and imposing fortresses. But the true experience of living inside these castles was far from the polished image of royalty we like to envision. Life within the walls was a constant struggle for comfort and survival, marked by discomfort, chaos, and a daily reminder that the notion of luxury in the Middle Ages was a far cry from what we understand today. Behind those stone facades, castles were less a refuge of indulgence and more a battleground of human endurance, where the quest for comfort was as desperate as it was futile. The great hall, the beating heart of the castle, was both a grand stage for social events and the gritty reality of feudal life. It was where the lord and his family dined, passed judgment, held court, and carried out the business of their estate. But it was also the room where the noise never stopped, where peasants argued over scraps, where the low hum of chatter echoed off stone walls, and where the sounds of feasts and disputes blended into a single cacophony. The Great Hall was in many ways the chaotic multi-purpose room of the medieval world, where everything happened in one place. It was a place of extremes, where power and politics mixed with noise and confusion, where food was served to the powerful in abundance, while the lesser folk huddled near the fire in hope of a morsel. This was no polished dining room, no gleaming hall, where knights and nobles dined in silence under gilded chandeliers. Instead, it was a place where the warmth of the hearth fought a constant battle against the cold stone walls that absorbed the chill of the outside world. There were no windows to offer respite from the oppressive gloom. Instead, there were narrow slits designed to defend against attackers, but offering little in the way of light or air. The stone floors were cold and uneven, the ceilings so high that the heat from the fires never reached the upper chambers. It was a room built for function, not comfort, designed to host endless feasts, legal proceedings, and social gatherings, but ill-suited to the warmth of human bodies trying to survive within its walls. The climate indoors was as harsh as the world outside. The constant drafts of cold air were the castle's most enduring feature, winding through the cracks in the stone, like unwanted visitors settling in the corners of the room and making everything feel perpetually damp. The wet stone walls, perpetually cool to the touch, seemed to sap the warmth from the fires. The hearths, though essential for providing heat and light, were often woefully insufficient, producing more smoke than comfort. The air was thick with it, filling the room with acrid fumes that clung to clothing and hair, leaving the smell of burnt wood and sweat in its wake. The ceilings, high as they were, provided no escape for the smoke, which would gather in the rafters and hover over the guests like a silent predator. Even the most luxurious furniture, if it could be called such, was often little more than crude wooden benches, hastily constructed tables, and animal skins thrown over straw mattresses. Noblemen, surrounded by their finest tapestries and heraldic banners, may have thought they lived in comfort, but that comfort was illusory. The heavy curtains of velvet or silk that decorated the walls did little to keep the cold at bay, and the grand feasts held in the great hall were often accompanied by bitter complaints about the cold, the smoke, and the chaos. The nobility might have sat at the head of the table dining on delicacies, but they were still subject to the same miserable conditions as the peasants who occupied the lower tiers of the hall. Noise was another constant in the life inside the castle. The great hall was alive with sound, from the clinking of goblets and the rattle of cutlery to the murmur of conversation and the occasional raised voice in anger or laughter. It was a place where the lord's authority was exerted, but it was also where the tension of medieval life played out in full view. The lords and ladies dined in the center, surrounded by their retainers, who ate on benches or the cold stone floor at the periphery. The sound of the meal itself, a hodgepodge of noisy, gobbling, grumbling bellies, and the clatter of food being consumed, added to the constant hum of activity in the hall. Every corner of the space was alive with chatter, laughter, and the rattle of dishes. But in a room so filled with people, it was easy for the important and the trivial to blend together. Arguments between peasants, often over something as small as a loaf of bread or a scrap of meat, could quickly escalate into shouting matches. In contrast, the nobles bickered over matters of land and justice, their voices rising above the din of their lessers. The sharp contrast between the daily business of the peasants and the grand concerns of the nobility gave the space an air of underlying tension, a reminder that power was never far from the surface. The Lord's Court was a microcosm of feudal society, chaotic, noisy, but ultimately defined by an ever-present struggle for control. One of the most unpleasant yet essential aspects of life inside the castle was waste management. Medieval sanitation systems were rudimentary at best, and the constant flow of people, food, and waste in the great hall often led to a particularly unsavory byproduct of castle life filth. Guardrobes, an ironic term for the latrines, were located either within the castle itself or outside, but in many cases the waste would simply be emptied directly into moats or nearby rivers. What was intended to be a defensive feature, a deep trench around the castle to keep invaders at bay, became a biological weapon in itself. During sieges, when supplies ran low and people were forced to dispose of waste within the castle's confines, the moat transformed from a defensive element into a filthy trap, contaminating the very water sources meant to keep the defenders alive. As the inhabitants of the castle became more desperate, the waste that was cast into these moats would multiply, turning the stagnant water into a foul, disease-ridden cesspool. With no modern plumbing and no real method of cleaning the waste from the castle's guardrobes would eventually rot and stew in the water, creating a foul-smelling, unhealthy environment that only added to the misery of life inside the walls. And the irony was not lost on anyone. Those who sought the protection of the castle were also forced to endure the physical and psychological discomfort that came with it. The once proud symbol of security was now tainted with the stench of human waste and decay, a reminder of the harshness of medieval life. While the Lord and his guests dined on fine meats, fruits, and breads, the rest of the inhabitants, the peasants, the servants, the soldiers, were left to survive on whatever scraps they could scrounge up. The food hierarchy inside the castle was brutally divided. The nobles feasted on roasted meats, freshly baked bread, and imported delicacies. They enjoyed the best wine-fresh fruit and spiced dishes from foreign lands. But for everyone else, the situation was far bleaker. The common folk, when they were fed at all, subsisted on overboiled, tasteless pottage, a watery stew made from whatever could be foraged or scraped together. Meat, if it appeared at all on their plates, was tough overcooked and filled with gristle. Vegetables were often boiled beyond recognition, stripped of their nutrients and flavor. Bread stale and hard was often served as the sole staple of a peasant's meal, used not only as a food source, but as a makeshift plate. It would be dipped into the pottage, a humble meal designed to stretch a meager food supply, but without any real thought for taste or pleasure. The food of the commoners was not a source of joy. It was a necessary evil meant to keep the body alive long enough to continue working. This food hierarchy mirrored the social order of the castle itself. The lords who could afford the finest ingredients and lavish feasts lived in a world far removed from the grim reality of the peasants. Their meals were an expression of power and indulgence, a means of displaying wealth and status. Meanwhile, the servants and peasants who worked to support the castle and its inhabitants ate whatever they could find. The food they consumed was as much a reflection of their station in life as the walls that divided them from the lords and ladies above. In many ways, food was a measure of social success: who ate well, who ate poorly, and who went hungry. The lavish feasts of the lords were a far cry from the meager rations of the peasants, but they were not entirely disconnected. In the great hall, as the noblemen and women enjoyed their extravagant meals, they were served by the very people who ate only the scraps left behind. The feasts, then, were not just a display of luxury, they were a reminder of power. The lords could afford the finest food, while the rest of the castle's inhabitants had to make do with whatever was left behind. The contrast between the food served to the noblemen and the food served to the peasants highlighted the inequalities of feudal life in the most visceral way. Thus, life inside the medieval castle was far from a romanticized vision of grandeur. It was a world of cold stone, smoke-filled rooms and constant noise. It was a world where the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning wood and wet stone, where the sound of food being served was drowned out by the noise of peasants fighting for scraps. It was a world where waste hunger and discomfort defined the experience, and where luxury was reserved for those fortunate enough to be born into power. For everyone else, the castle was not a sanctuary. It was a cold, noisy, uncomfortable home. Section 11. Castles as tools of control and psychological government. Medieval castles were not merely physical structures. They were tools of power and instruments of control. The stones and mortar that held them together were not simply designed to withstand siege engines or enemy attacks. They were purposefully arranged to communicate a far more insidious message. I am the Lord of all that you see and you are mine to command. The towering walls, the high keeps, the imposing gatehouses. They were not just defenses against invaders. They were the physical embodiment of feudal dominance, a constant visible reminder of who owned the land, who controlled the people, and who held the power. A castle was a fortress of the mind as much as it was a fortress of stone. Its very presence declared that its inhabitants were untouchable, elevated not only above the surrounding land, but above the people who worked it. The lord who resided within its walls was not just a ruler of a territory. He was a living symbol of divine right. His power, written in every brick of his castle. From the very beginning of a lord's reign, his castle was meant to project an image of superiority, wealth, and invincibility. A castle, after all, was much more than a seat of power. It was the physical manifestation of the power itself, a statement carved in stone. The Lord's chamber, perched high above the lower levels of the castle, was a clear visual metaphor. The Lord was elevated physically higher than his subjects, signifying both his superiority and his distance from the people who served him. The architecture of the castle reinforced this hierarchy. The Lord's chamber, always located in the highest part of the castle, was a sacred space, a place of isolation and privilege that set him apart from the rest of the world. This elevation was not just symbolic, it was practical. The higher a lord's chamber, the safer it was from attack. But beyond the strategic considerations, the message was clear. The Lord lived above it all. His chamber, often placed above the great hall and away from the noise and chaos of everyday castle life, was meant to reinforce his position as the ultimate authority. He was removed from the struggles of the lower classes, set apart by not just his wealth and power, but by the very physical layout of the castle. Below the Lord in the great hall was a different reality. The hall was where the business of life and governance took place, where meals were served, justice was meted out, and feasts were held in the presence of family, friends, and vassals. But the very design of the hall, with its long tables and clear separation between the Lord's seat and those of his subjects, served to reinforce the social order. The Lord sat at the head of the table, the highest seat, while his subjects sat below him, reinforcing the idea that they were there to serve, not to lead. This physical hierarchy was more than just a seating arrangement. It was a visible reminder of the power dynamics that governed the entire society. Castles, in their sheer size and grandeur, were meant to be seen from miles away. They were deliberately placed at the highest points in the landscape, often on hills, cliffs, or ridges, making them visible to all who approached. From the distance, the castle looked like an impenetrable fortress, soaring high into the sky, with its stone walls and towers casting long shadows over the land. To those who lived in the surrounding villages, the castle was a constant reminder of the Lord's power, a symbol that could not be ignored. It was a physical manifestation of ownership, and it served as a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. From the watchtowers and high walls, the Lord could see everything. The land surrounding the castle, the roads that led to the village, the fields where peasants worked, everything was under the Lord's watchful eye. The towers with their high vantage points were not just defensive structures, they were surveillance posts. From these towers, the Lord could spot any approaching threat, be it an invading army, or a peasant rebellion. But the towers were more than just places of observation. They were a visible presence that served to remind the people that they were always being watched. No one, not even the lowliest peasant, could walk the roads or work in the fields without knowing that the Lord could see them. This surveillance was a constant, unspoken reminder that the Lord's power was everywhere, that his eyes were always on those who worked his land, and that any attempt to defy him would be seen and punished. The physical layout of the castle and its elevated position also served a more insidious purpose. Castles were designed to intimidate. Their sheer size and imposing structures were meant to make any would-be rebel think twice. To be near a castle was to be constantly reminded of your subjugation. The walls and towers were more than just walls. They were barriers of power, designed to enforce obedience. As much as they kept out invaders, they also kept in the peasants who worked the land. The castle was a fortress of control, both physical and psychological. For the peasants, the sight of a castle looming in the distance was a reminder that they lived under the Lord's authority. It was a constant presence, a reminder of their place in the social order. The castle was not just a physical fortress, it was a mental prison as well. The peasants knew their place. They worked the land, paid their dues, and served their Lord. To rebel against the Lord was to rebel against the very structure of society itself, a society that was reinforced by the castle's towering walls. And yet the psychological power of the castle went deeper than mere intimidation. It was not just a symbol of authority, it was a symbol of divine favor. In a time when religion and monarchy were inextricably linked, castles were also meant to represent the Lord's divinely appointed rule. The idea of divine right, that the king or lord was chosen by God to rule, was a central tenet of medieval governance, and the castle served as a physical representation of that divine endorsement. The very height of the castle, its stone walls and its towers were meant to demonstrate that the Lord was above all, and that his rule was sanctioned by a higher power. The Lord's chamber, elevated and secluded, was not just a seat of earthly power. It was a throne of divine right, an expression of the belief that the Lord's authority was not just political, but spiritual. In this sense, the castle was not just a fortress or a home. It was a tool of governance. It was designed to exert control, to reinforce social hierarchies, and to ensure that rebellion was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. The castle sent a clear message to the peasants. Obedience was not just necessary, it was a matter of survival. To challenge the Lord was to challenge the very structure of the universe, and the consequences would be dire. This message was reinforced by the castle's design, the towering walls, the surveillance towers, the thick gates, and the elevated chambers of the Lord. Everything about the castle, from its structure to its layout, was meant to communicate one simple idea. The Lord ruled, and rebellion was futile. In the end, the castle was not just a place of defense. It was a monument to power, a manifestation of the belief that control over the land, the people, and even the divine could be asserted through architecture. It was a tool of psychological government, a structure built to intimidate, to surveil, and to reinforce the social order. The Lord's power was not just an abstract concept. It was something tangible, something that could be seen, touched, and felt in the very stone of the castle walls. The castle was not just a physical fortress, it was the embodiment of the Lord's rule, a constant reminder to all who lived under its shadow that they were under his control, and that any challenge to that control would be met with swift and brutal force. And so, as the Lord gazed out from his high chamber, surveying the land below, he could be sure of one thing. His authority was not just secure, it was unassailable. The castle's walls had done their work. The peasants who toiled in the fields below would not rise up, not when the weight of their Lord's power pressed down on them from every direction. The castle had done more than protect him from invaders, it had protected his authority from the very people it ruled. Section 12. Decline, Reinvention, and the Gunpowder Problem. The world of castles, once the epitome of medieval strength, began its inexorable decline with the arrival of a game-changing invention, gunpowder. This explosive substance, which had already altered the landscape of warfare, with its use in firearms and cannons, marked the beginning of the end for the castles that had stood unchallenged for centuries. Stone, which had once symbolized strength, endurance, and invulnerability, suddenly seemed fragile in the face of gunpowder's destructive power. The thick walls that had kept invaders at bay for generations were no longer sufficient to withstand the barrage of cannonballs, and the towering keeps, which had once been so formidable, now felt like little more than stone tombs, vulnerable to the fiery wrath of artillery. Gunpowder, as it turned out, was the great equalizer of medieval warfare. With it, attackers could breach even the most formidable of castles with shocking speed. A single cannonball could smash through the thickest of walls, reducing centuries of meticulous stonework to rubble. Castles, once designed to repel sieges that could last months or even years, now faced a new kind of warfare, one that could flatten their defenses in a matter of hours. The age of impregnable stone fortresses had come to an end, and with it, the era of castle dominance on the battlefield. At first, castle designers and builders sought to adapt. There were attempts to reinforce the existing structures, lowering the walls, thickening the bases, and adding earth ramparts to absorb the impact of cannon fire. But these changes were more like desperate measures than practical solutions. Gunpowder had fundamentally altered the dynamics of warfare, and no amount of stone or earth could change the fact that castles had become increasingly obsolete as defensive structures. The siege engines of the past, with their slow and cumbersome progress, were replaced by cannons that could be loaded and fired in a fraction of the time with far greater force. The true transformation came not in the effort to adapt castles for military use, but in their gradual reinvention as palaces and showpiece residences. Castles, once symbols of military might and strategic importance, became increasingly irrelevant as power dynamics shifted and the need for fortified structures faded. Lords and kings, once preoccupied with maintaining their strongholds against invasions and uprisings, began to see castles not as fortresses, but as symbols of wealth, status, and taste. The walls, once thick and defensive, were now seen as unnecessary encumbrances. In their place, large windows were carved into the stone, allowing for more light and air luxuries that had previously been impossible in the cramped, windowless chambers of medieval fortresses. The harsh utilitarian design of the castle gave way to a more refined and comfortable aesthetic. The battlements, which had once been designed for defense, were now reimagined as decorative elements. No longer did they serve as platforms for archers or defenders to pour boiling oil down upon invaders. Now, they were little more than ornamental flourishes added to give the castle a medieval look, a nostalgic nod to its past grandeur. The moats once vital for defense were drained and transformed into gardens. These serene spaces were filled with carefully manicured lawns, flower beds, and fountains, beautiful reminders of the shift from fortress to residence. Castles which had once been the fortresses of war now became the early prototypes of luxury real estate. The heavy stone walls, once the markers of power and protection, were replaced by finer architectural elements that spoke of taste and sophistication. Large windows allowed for panoramic views of the surrounding lands, and the interiors were outfitted with the finest furnishings, tapestries, and paintings. The lords who lived within these newly transformed castles were no longer concerned with repelling invaders. Their focus was on maintaining their status among the nobility and impressing visitors with their wealth and refinement. The transformation of castles into palaces was not just an aesthetic shift. It was a profound change in the way power was displayed. No longer was power measured solely by military strength. It was now measured by cultural capital, by the ability to showcase one's wealth knowledge and connection to the greater world. Castles, which had once been utilitarian fortresses designed to repel attackers, became symbols of the sophistication of their owners. The fine art of the Renaissance, with its emphasis on beauty and humanism, began to influence the architecture of these castles. The sturdy, oppressive walls that had once held back the forces of war were replaced by more elegant designs. High ceilings, intricate woodwork, and expansive galleries filled with artwork that depicted the lords and their families in regal poses. As castles shifted from military fortresses to palatial estates, they also began to reflect the changing times. The growing wealth of Europe's elite, coupled with the waning threat of invasion, meant that the once essential role of castles as defensive structures became less relevant. Lords and kings no longer needed to live behind walls of stone to protect themselves from the outside world. Instead, they sought to display their power through culture and luxury. The castle, once a fortress of fear, had now become a fortress of taste, a place where art, beauty, and comfort reigned supreme. But the transition was not without its difficulties. As castles transformed into palaces, they became increasingly impractical. The massive walls that once protected their inhabitants now served only as a reminder of the past. The need for such grand, imposing structures diminished, and many of the once powerful families who lived in these castles found themselves struggling to maintain them. Some castles, which had once been the seats of great lords, became too expensive to keep up and eventually fell into disrepair. Others were sold their grand interiors, stripped of their luxurious furnishings, and turned into museums or tourist attractions. In this new era, the castle had undergone its final transformation. No longer a symbol of military might, it had become a testament to the wealth and culture of the noble class. It was now a place to showcase power in more subtle ways, a reflection of the shift in how power itself was understood. Instead of war and conquest, it was culture and taste that defined the nobility's standing. Castles, once the most secure places on earth, had become little more than relics of a bygone age, monuments to a time when the greatest power lay in the strength of stone walls and the might of armies. By the time the Renaissance dawned and the world began to shift again, the castle was no longer the center of feudal society. It had evolved from a place of defense to a place of elegance and prestige. It was no longer a tool for survival. It had become a symbol of opulence, a relic of a time when power was defended by stone and iron, not by diplomacy and wealth. Castles were no longer fortresses. They were palaces of taste and luxury, embodying the shift from a world of warfare to one of culture and refinement. What was once a structure built to withstand sieges and protect those inside from the ravages of war had now become a showcase of wealth, a grand residence for those who no longer needed protection. Castles had ceased to be fortresses of war. They had become fortresses of taste. Conclusion. Castles as lasting symbols of fear, ambition, and stubborn human pride. As we stand at the base of a towering medieval castle, or gaze at its weathered silhouette against the horizon, we are not simply looking at an ancient building. We are encountering centuries of human ambition, of survival, and of power. Castles in their mighty form were the physical manifestations of the struggle to impose control over the land and the people within it. They were as much about the psychology of dominance as they were about the practicality of defense. Castles were not just shelters from the storm. They were stones carved with messages of superiority, strength, and invincibility. Even as the centuries pass and their walls crumble into the earth, the legacy of the castle endures in ways that few structures can claim. Though their military role faded with the advent of new technologies, most notably gunpowder and the cannon, their cultural and psychological impact remains a testament to their original purpose. Castles were never simply about keeping invaders out or securing a lord's personal safety. They were about creating an image, a statement, a monument to one's place in the social hierarchy. They served as symbols of control, not only over land, but also over people's perceptions of their rulers. The lord who resided within the stone walls was not simply the owner of a fortress. He was the embodiment of the idea that power could be etched into the landscape itself. Castles were in many ways a visual declaration of authority that transcended the immediate necessity of defense. Even today, the psychological resonance of castles is palpable. When we look at the remnants of a great fortress, the impressions it leaves on us are not just historical. They are emotional. There is a sense of awe and intimidation that accompanies the sight of a towering castle. These structures were built to dominate not just the physical space around them, but the minds of all who beheld them. The towering walls, the imposing gates, the high watchtowers, they were all designed to communicate one simple idea. Power resides here, and it is unyielding. The architecture of the medieval castle spoke to people's deepest anxieties and desires. In an age where survival was uncertain and social order was fragile, the castle was a reassuring promise of safety, even if that safety came at the cost of the peasants' subjugation. And even as the power of the castle waned, the psychological imprint it left on society endured, informing how we continue to perceive and build power to this very day. In many ways, the towering skyscrapers and corporate headquarters that define modern skylines are the spiritual descendants of the medieval castle. The vertical dominance that once defined a castle, its towering keep raised high above the surrounding landscape, now finds its parallel in the gleaming steel and glass of the modern high-rise, just as the medieval lord would have surveyed his domain from the heights of his stone tower. Today's corporate magnates and political elites survey their empires from their lofty offices perched high above the streets below. The architectural ambition behind skyscrapers, the need to build higher to assert vertical dominance, and to create structures that symbolize wealth, power, and security, is a direct continuation of the desires that fueled the construction of castles. Where the medieval castle once communicated its might through stone and mortar, today's skyscrapers communicate it through technology and glass. The symbols may have changed, but the core desire for dominance and control remains the same. Skyscrapers, like castles, are not just buildings, they are statements. They tower over the landscape, casting long shadows on the world beneath them. They are not merely places where business is conducted. They are physical representations of the power and influence that resides within them. And just as the medieval castle was a fortress of taste, a way for its owner to display wealth and superiority, so too are modern buildings designed with the same eye toward grandeur and spectacle. The trappings may be different glass instead of stone chrome, instead of timber, but the spirit of the structure remains unchanged. The human need to build power into the landscape to create symbols of authority that endure is timeless. Castles were, in a sense, survival dressed as art. They were built not just to protect, but to display the power of their owners, to remind everyone who passed by, who held dominion over the land. In their very design, they were artful expressions of human pride and ambition. The massive stone walls, the imposing towers, the elaborate battlements, they were all crafted to evoke awe and fear. They were meant to be admired, but also feared. The architecture of the castle was not merely functional. It was a way of shaping the world in the image of its builder. And even as these stone giants fall to ruin, their influence lives on in the buildings we create today. Modern architecture, with its grandiose skyscrapers and corporate palaces, is still influenced by the same desires that drove the construction of castles: the need to assert power, to display wealth, and to remind the world that the land beneath those walls or beneath those steel and glass towers is under control. The once impenetrable walls of the castle have given way to the smooth surfaces of glass and steel. But the essence of what they represented, dominance, fear, and pride, remains as present as ever. The landscape may have changed, but the impulse to control it, to carve one's name into it, to leave a legacy behind, endures. Castles, with their thick stone walls, their lofty towers, and their impregnable gates, were designed to stand the test of time. They were built to outlast wars, revolutions, and the ravages of history. And in many ways, they have done just that. Though the castles themselves may crumble, the ideas behind them continue to influence the way we build and the way we think about power. The castles of old may no longer serve as fortresses of defense, but their legacy lives on in the very architecture of our cities. Castles were more than just buildings. They were the symbols of an age that revered strength and control. And in that legacy, we find the blueprint for the cities of today. As we look to the future, we can see that the castle's legacy will not soon fade. The buildings we create today may be different in form, but the desire to create spaces that symbolize power, wealth, and authority remains unchanged. Castles may no longer dominate the horizon, but their spirit lives on in the skyscrapers and monuments that define the modern world. The stones of the past may crumble, but the idea behind them, the idea that power, when etched into the landscape, never truly dies, continues to shape our cities and our society. Castles were, in the end, not just a product of their time, but a reflection of the eternal human need to leave a mark on the world and to build something that will stand for all eternity. And so, as we stand amidst the ruins of a once great castle, or as we look up at the modern skyscrapers that dominate our cities, we are reminded that the desire to build, to create power, and to leave a legacy is something that transcends time. Castles may have crumbled, but the idea of power, dominance, and the human drive to leave a lasting impression on the world never really dies. The stones may fall, but the ambition behind them remains unshaken, etched into the landscape for all to see.